Hello, everyone. Welcome to Literary Nights with Unsolicited Press. I'm here tonight with Carolina and Jacob, and tonight we're going to have a real poetry extravaganza. Before we begin, I would like to remind you all to hit the like button and subscribe, so this way you'll get notifications of when our next stream readings take place, and also to make sure you tune in all the time. So, Carolina and Jacob, welcome to Literary Nights with Unsolicited Press. I know that we're going to be having a poetry extravaganza tonight. So, we usually go in alphabetical order, which makes, if we go by first name, Jacob is first. I mean, by second name, Jacob is first, Jacob Appel. So, Jacob, you want to start with you, and then we'll move to Carolina. We'll listen to your poetry, and then we're followed by a Q&A afterwards. Thank you.
Sure, and thank you for having us. This is very exciting. And I will confess, I am primarily a fiction writer. I've written 19 volumes of fiction and only one volume of poetry, so I'm not used to reading poetry, but I will give it my best shot. And that being said, most of my poetry at least has some formal elements in it, but it's not formal poetry. But I strive to have some traditional meter or something marginally recognizable. So with that being said, I'm going to read a handful of poems from my forthcoming collection, The View from the Curb, which is heavily suburbanly inflected. People think nothing happens in the suburbs. And in essence, my poems are about the things that don't happen in the suburbs. So this first poem is about the pets I never had. So it's called The Lorikeet. The puppy we never adopted went unwalked through my childhood, failing to paw the upholstery or scar our frisbee with canines. He did not chase the other pets we never owned, hamsters, hedgehogs, that one-eared Abyssinian tabby who didn't trail us home from the park. No backyard Karen marked his grave, nor grade school eulogy recalled his unbarked rage at those bunnies we left behind in the shop. Our mom feared rabies and fevers. Droppings riled our dad, so no lorikeet surrogated at breakfast, and that pup neither frisked nor fetched. But once, tail wagging, he retrieved that doubtful lorikeet between his doggy teeth, and how I sobbed over that absent bird. Even now, I am still mourning. Another poem of suburbia, this one after Robert Hayden. Some of you may know his very unsettling poem, Those Winter Mornings. So mine is those summer breakfasts. Every humdrum school day morning, fall, winter, spring, fall, my father braved the cheerless suburban dawn for his paper. He'd read in ruthless silence, wingtip loafers perched atop a kitchen chair, blue smoke curling from the bowl of his churchwarden pipe. Already my robe-swept mother, aglow with effervescent blear, had cleared the draining board, brewed coffee, stirred cinnamon into my steaming cream of wheat. But summers, no school bus waiting, and chancery out of session, he'd edified me with excerpts, War and Diplomacy, Carter and Ford, Entebbe, Soweto, Isabel Perón. If my focus wandered, followed my mother's glance toward Papa's shoes, toward the windows she would open as soon as he departed for the train, she'd warn, listen to your father. His litigator's steel baritone pierced the smoke, and had I paid attention with greater care, I'd have understood their tones, their looks, their silent nods, how they suffered each other for my benefit. Now, a piece a little bit more uplifting, called Barbarism. My barber is dead, Luigi from Palermo, pendulous ears, untrimmed nostrils, and as solid a fellow as Frank Sinatra. Nobody to replace him. Today, it's all unisex and chic salons, handsome young dressers charging like surgeons, requiring reservations. I let my locks grow long. I look like Rapunzel on a pad hair day, or some hippie deadbeat folk rock flashback set to belt through unshorn soup bowl bangs. Where have all the barbers gone? No, it's not a world for barbers anymore. Luigi should thank his lucky shears to have cashed out before the shop payphone, where men still rang high-stakes numbers, and Puccini owned the airwaves. And I, with my cascading mane, on the wrong side of tonsorial history, asking, when the last barber dies, who will be called to shave him for the grave? Let me read a couple more. Um, Something a little bit more serious. Somebody I was once very close to and romantically very interested in committed suicide a number of years ago. So here is my postscript. Think back before you transferred schools, before I sent you mixtapes and men didn't, before you married the car wash kahuna, before you married the widowed Lebanese broker, before the broker carried your kids off to the Levant, before you drank that half pint of Cointreau and took that wooded razor to the bath, and left me in the pregnant autumn chill to steady your mother through the cottage. Think back before that. It's a day like any other, maybe more so. We're fourth graders or possibly fifth. I believe that was the mock election year, and you played a fiery Geraldine Ferraro in an accent to rival Katharine Hepburn's. Safe between the foam padded walls of the gymnasium, where my wife and I still vote for real on election days. And the note that I slid towards your lap was intercepted by the imperious Mr. Rand. Do you remember how you refused to surrender that tattered loose leaf page until I bid you? How I read our minor shame into the risers? Think of that note reaching for your fingers. May I have it back just for a moment? I want to write I love you at the end. And let us read one more poem, something a little bit more traditional. Um, so, for those of you who are fans of trochaic hexameter, which nobody reads anymore, writes anymore, I will give you something in trochaic meter called Passover Cleaning. I may be the only Jewish poet ever to write in trochaic meter, so I will take advantage of that. Papa never used a candle like our forebears in the shtetl, nor a wooden spoon and feather, though he did discard the chametz. Stole the liquor at $1 to a kindly Catholic neighbor, for repurchase 8 days later. Kosher deal is in God's accounting. While the rest went to the curbside, winter stash of chips and crackers, martyr tins of virgin cookies, sweets enough to feed a kingdom, sacrificed like Egypt's children, all except the bread and muffins. Those we carted to the duck pond, under grandma's supervision. Pitched the geese a daylight seder, named each of those baby fowlets, matzo balls of tiny goslings, let the swans and mallards squabble over crusts of Pector's rye loaves, gulping our sins down their gullets. So I thought at 6 and 7, muddling leaven with Caporus, till the town installed a break wall with a filter for green algae. So we found that Pesach morning, no birds, only lifeless ripples. Shocked, I stood beside the shoreline, pockets full of fusty croutons, swallowing divine betrayal, faith drowning in shallow water. And I will stop there, and I thank you very much.
Thank you so much for reading from your wonderful poetry. And now we're going to listen to Carolina, and I think it's Carolina, correct? And she's going to be
Carolina,
reading
yeah.
from her newly published book.
Okay. Sorry, I wasn't sure if the sound had cut out temporarily, but thank you all so much for the opportunity to read for you. And thank you, Rosalia, for organizing these literary nights, and to Unsolicited Press for publishing such wonderful writers. Thank you, Jacob, for that wonderful poetry. I'm glad that you're publishing poetry, even though you're primarily prose. And so tonight, I'll be reading from a few poems from my poetry collection, which is titled True Stories. I guess funny that the title of the poetry collection is True Stories, even though it's poetry. And it was released last week, and I'm excited to read a few poems for you all today. And so this first poem has a bleeding title. And so the title is the first line of the poem. And this was originally published in Emerge Literary Journal in 2021. And it is called I Become a Hurricane. I become a hurricane again because I loved too much and used the same words for loving, always flooding and eroding and rising and swirling. All my first times felt like whirling. A wind filled the bedsheet sail and glided me. In the bed sense, drench is a good thing, but the fecund waters of my body frightened. The hunger of my legs turned instead into running, a river overflowing. I was always sore in the morning. What better word to describe these rains from clear skies, and dawn was pink outside the way it wasn't quite so inside me. And for that, I'll always feel closed. This eye, the bloody center, is a darker texture, and yet still salty like tears or seawater. And this next poem was also first published in 2021 in Whale Road Review, and it is called What Grows in the Garden. We both stay awake all night, trying to make it through a trial. Pluck a spearmint leaf to rest on, a tongue like the body of a savior savors sweet green and blue tint flavor. Sharp cool keeps one of us awake. Fresh figs split open, reveal slick insides. Eat just enough to stave off slumber, stay hungry. What else to sink our teeth into to keep us going until fluorescent dawn? You sip the cold water, and my eyes droop from the wine. And this next poem was first published in 2020 in Verse Virtual's pandemic issue. And that April 2020, early pandemic days, I had taken on the personal challenge of writing a poem every day during that month. Because what else are you going to do during the first days of that pandemic or of the pandemic that is continuing? And I actually ended up writing an average of 2 poems a day. But then of the 60 poems that I wrote, only a small handful actually went anywhere and did anything. I actually did anything with those poems. And this poem that I'm going to read was one of them. And so this poem is called "Is It Nice Where You Are?" Here there is sunlight on the dewdrops, glistening the leaves. Glitter hints the snap peas they'll grow into end of spring. The wood porch is warm, and the seat a dream nap stretched out in a field. Unnamed birds wing their way and sing in the branches of an old fir. There is nothing like it. Feast for every sense. In the evenings, all there is rest. Is it nice where you are? Though I may pace the same carpeted square feet, lushness blooms from my vacuum tracks. Is it nice? Tell me it is nice where you are. And I'm going to read 2 more poems. And these next 2 poems actually have not been previously published, nor have I read them anywhere. And so this is the first time that I'm actually reading them in front of an audience. And so this first poem is called Windfall. I've seen men ignore figs in front of them, reach for unripe greens, holding fast to limbs, instead of fruit crush flushed and wind fallen. I waited, with grass stained knees, for a turn around the garden, tree of knowledge orchard. Eating what was given, I learned the sweetest juice came from bruises on fruit left by gravity and the ground. I know now the first step of falling in love is falling from grace, is picking figs off the ground for the banquet table while having one in your teeth for a taste. And this last poem that I'm going to read is also, again, previously unpublished. It's in the book and hasn't been read by me anywhere else. But this particular poem, when my older sister received her copy of the book, she posted to her Instagram story when she noticed that I included her in the acknowledgements page, and she was very excited and very happy about that. And it was unexpected for her. But then she said that pages 23 and 31 were her favorites. And this poem is on page 31, and it is called On the First Nice Day. On the first nice day of the summer, I wrote a sad poem. The air quality index was in the green, and I was cool in the shade. Cool enough that sweat didn't bead slick behind my knees or where my thighs slid together. Dry, I wrote a sad poem about time melting and running freely. It won't be the only poem I write. That page wasn't big enough for every metaphor I ever want to use. On the first nice day of the summer, I wrote a sad poem because it was the first clear day, air quality index low and in the green, where I could breathe that needed sigh of relief. Lately, I've been afraid to exhale too hard. Nowadays, the sun sets burnt crisp at its circular edge. My sadness couldn't hold a candle. I might have ruined the first nice day, air quality index in the green, with my paltry feelings. Thank you. Rosalia, I think you might be muted.
Yes, I am. Thank you both for such wonderful poetry. And I want to express my incredible wonder that you actually set out to write a poem or two a day during the pandemic. I think the pandemic hit people differently. Either they were, writing clouds and clouds of words, or they were rendered in the opposite direction, unable to write at all, and maybe just happy to write one true sentence a day. So I really want to say that. And both of your poetry is really amazing. So Jacob, what gave you the idea to write about things that don't happen in the suburbs, like especially after writing 19 volumes of prose?
Well, I feel like my whole childhood was things that didn't happen in the suburbs. Only I didn't really realize it until I grew up, and I realized both all of the interesting things that happened to other people and the interesting things that happened to me that were things that didn't happen, if that makes any sense. Um, and so I think I'm a psychiatrist in my real life. I like to add, everybody else was writing during the pandemic. I was actually in the hospital, so all I got to do was write patient charts. But it does give you a lot of time to
Oh.
sort of think and reflect on what happened over the course of your lifetime. So I think poetry sort of came out of, in part, the experience of being in the hospital in a tense situation and not having the space to write a novel, but having the emotional reserve or need to say something.
Wow, that's incredible. That's incredible that you were able to, even though you were in the hospital, still reach and hold on to your literary underpinnings. And Carolina, your work is so also so poignant. What gave you the idea of writing true stories in poetry form?
Yeah. So I think the title of the book, I guess, comes from a specific poem that um, has the same title, but then is how do I describe it? How do I describe this poem? It's a poem about a novel that I actually read when I was in middle school. I'm actually also I grew up in the suburbs too, the sort of northern Illinois suburbs, and my hometown used to flood a lot. And I remember once my middle school librarian told us about this novel that was written about the last time our town really flooded very severely. That an author was so inspired by this that they wrote a middle grade novel about the fact that the middle school and I believe the elementary school, because they were flooded, had to actually hold their classes for a week in the local strip mall. And so in the middle of trying to learn like math and everything, you're like in these various stores and then like all these different lessons that are happening in various places. And I was inspired by that. And so I think that um I don't know, for me it was like sort of trying to find the pattern of the sort of cyclical flooding that would happen in my hometown, and then also like the experience of reading, like being in middle school and reading about these middle schoolers. Like I think like Jacob, your point of like the interesting things that happen in the suburbs or the thing that don't happen to you like that like I also sort of resonate with that experience. And so I feel like I don't know, poetry like is I guess like every time I have an experience where I think, oh, I have a really good line, or like there's an image that really is standing out to me, I find it easier to write it into a poem. Partly because it is so compressed, and partly because there is attention that's being paid to the specific lines and how they're ending, or the meter and like the particular forms. If you're writing formal poetry, like I think that it's a different creative exercise than writing prose, that I feel, I don't know, there's like a lot of opportunity to do some really interesting things within poems. And so even though it's called true stories, like I think that for me as a writer, like I am much more, I guess, like inspired to write a lot more poetry, I guess. Um, yeah.
So that brings us to another question, Jacob. What? How did you approach the difference between writing poetry and writing prose? Did it change your prose after you wrote the poetry? Did you find yourself putting poetic lines in your prose? Did it change you as a writer? How does because poetry is condensed and very short, whereas novels are not condensed. They're the complete opposite. So how did it change your approach to the work?
So it's interesting you asked that, because my literary writing, my fiction, is not remotely poetic. Nobody would claim otherwise. I mean, there are people who come to writing as failed poets, and those who come as hyper successful journalists. And I don't know if I was a successful journalist, but I used to be a journalist, so it's very straight shooting in that way. And I think to some degree, my poems, especially if I don't have any form to them, would take that shape. So I really have come to rely on forms to force me to at least follow some poetic structure. And I think the poets I, in some ways, most admire are people like Philip Larkin, who may be a terrible person, but was still a great poet, because they can write formal poetry that you don't realize is formal poetry until you look through it very closely.
So do you think moving forward, when you are you gonna, when you return to prose, do you think it will change a little bit now that you have successfully written poetry? Because I think Mary Oliver, a poet, has said that there's poetry in everything, whether it's prose or poems. So do you find yourself inadvertently, or maybe not even realizing it, putting metaphors and images in your prose that you had not done before?
Well, the best answer I can give to that is there was poetry in everything Mary Oliver wrote. If a small little piece of that falls on my prose, I will be grateful forever. So I may try, but whether it succeeds or not is a different story.
So let's talk about the writing process. How do Carolina, you had your impressive writing a poem a day during the pandemic. And Jacob, you reached for your literary underpinnings when you were ill. So how do you each approach work? Do you each keep journals every day? Do you write every day? Do you have a specific time that you work, that you dedicate to the writing practice, or to the writing practice? So how do you each approach your work?
Yeah, if it's okay, I'll sort of jump in. I aspirationally try to write every day. I do keep a journal, and I try to write just sort of like 3 pages of free writing of just sort of whatever comes to mind first thing in the morning. However, whenever I go back and look at those pages, it is definitely like 3 pages of things that I would not want to revisit or like put into any kind of published writing. And so I think that my process has also changed quite a bit over the years. Like I think also with each project, it kind of happens in a new way. Like I think I'm at work on a second collection of poetry right now, and I think that there were some poems that I had written like a few years ago that are sort of finding their way into this collection. But then now I'm also finding myself trying to write poems that are like moving towards the overall themes of the collection that I'm starting to put together. And whereas for True Stories, it was very much like, here are the poems that I have, here are the poems that have started getting published, and then what themes can I sort of notice from what I've been able to put out there. And so I feel like I feel like every year or so there's some change to my like writing process that I don't notice until I sort of take a moment to pause and look back and see, okay, what was I actually doing a year ago? Like, was it the same thing? Oftentimes I was doing something completely different. Like, I think this time last year, I was focusing much more on doing a lot of reading because I'm in a graduate program right now, and so part of my like responsibilities over the summer is to like teach and to also um I guess like just keep up with the reading that I've set for myself, which in a way is like sort of self-inflicted. And so I feel like last year a lot of my writing process was actually a reading process, whereas this year like I'm a lot more focused on, can I get, 3 pages of something down a day. And so I feel like it's a process for me that changes pretty wildly depending on sort of what project I'm sort of I'm working on right now. So
No, I would say that I'm at the opposite end of the spectrum in some ways. I mean, Grace Pally, I think, famously said that she did her best writing in the bathtub, And while I have never been in a bathtub with Grace Paley, for better or for worse, I assume she meant that metaphorically, meaning that when she lives her life, she thinks about what she's going to write. And because I work in a psychiatric emergency room, basically I spend most of my time on my feet with time to think. And then when I do have a little bit of time, I can sit down and write what I've been thinking about. So it's really, I always say, if we have a quiet day in the ER or the junior doctors are really good, then I have time to write. And if one or the other of those is not true, then I don't have time to write.
It's amazing to me how dedicated people are to the craft of writing, how they fit it in various times, how they, unbeknownst and maybe much to the chagrin of family members, are like, "What are you doing?" "I'm writing." Who don't understand that it is a craft and the craft needs constant attention. Or I don't know who said it, writing is a jealous master. So, in terms of your book, how long, like, when did you realize that when did both of you realize that you had a collection of poetry that could be a standalone work that could be publishable?
I'll also jump in on this. I think that I maybe realized that I had a collection going. I want to say, I think it was actually after that April when I wrote a bunch of those poems and sort of looking through, and then sort of mashing them together with poems that I had been writing for a few years before that. And I think that there was actually another collection that I was working on, or like how do I phrase this? Sorry, I'm like thinking through this answer at the same time that I'm speaking. But there was a collection that I was working on that was actually about a completely different theme, even though a lot of the poems actually remained the same. But then it was the combination of that sort of initial collection that I was working on for a few years, and then the pandemic, what I in my mind refer to as my pandemic poems or early pandemic poems, and then realizing that I could actually put these two things together and it became a completely different project. And so I want to say it was probably after that April 2020 when I realized, okay, here are some poems that I have been writing. Here are the poems that I'm writing right now. And even though like they're about completely different experiences, pre-pandemic and during the pandemic, there was like I felt like I realized that there were more connections and more, I guess, like themes that I could work with that weren't just that prior collection, which was much more about family. And oh, sorry, there was a horn that just sounded outside my window, so I don't know if that got caught up in the mic. But the previous collection was much more about family and much more about extreme weather and some major storms that had happened that I had experienced. And so once I put that together with the pandemic poems, then it became much more a collection about disasters, and that was the thing that I was sort of working towards. And so I think it was mostly like after I had sat with a project for a few years and then had this new fresh work that felt very urgent at the time, and then realizing that I could put those two things together. I think that that's when I realized, okay, this is actually a completely different book than what I had originally thought it was going to be. Um, yeah.
See, Carolina has to think about this because she has a wide range as a poet. Since I have a very narrow range as a poet, all I have to do is write poems because they're all going to fit into the very narrow collections I have. And then when I run out of paper or ink, I know I'm done. And I say that half facetiously, but it's kind of true, in the sense that all the poems that I ever write are going to fit into a very narrow set of themes. So as soon as I have enough that they make a collection, I'm more or less done. And then I may reorder them a bit or decide a few of them aren't good. Maybe a lot of them aren't good. But it's not that I'm suddenly going to write deep epic poems in a different subject.
I really enjoyed your poem about the barber because it's so true. You don't Barbers are few and far between these days. You do need to have an appointment or a reservation, and there's no such thing as simple barbering. Was that poem based on someone that really was from Palermo who did barbering in your town, or was that something that you noticed when you were making an appointment for a haircut?
With slight changes in the details. I for some reason, do like that sense of the older Italian barber shop and a certain feel to it. And as there are fewer and fewer of them, I have to drive further and further and further away to find somebody who meets that standard. So I have found someone, but I have to drive about an hour to get there now. But yes, it's very much inflected by several barbers of my childhood, all of whom I think have gone on to the great barber shop in the sky.
And also your poem about the pets that you didn't have. To me, that was hilarious because um, there's a lot of people who say you want a pet. There's a dog next door. Go pet that. Go pet that dog next door. Whether that's in the city or in the county. So talk a little bit about that poem.
Sure. So I very much wanted to get a pet when I was growing up, and I had a different idea for what pet I would get every year. And my parents always said next year. And then at some point, I realized I graduated from college, and I was still asking, and then it was probably too late to ask them. So I will add, by the way, that the minute I graduated from college, my parents got a pet rabbit. So life is unfair.
That's pretty funny. Do you have pets now?
I don't, because now I work a schedule in the hospital that's not pet intensive. Yeah, someday.
And Carolina, I noticed that one of your poems talked about the index, the air quality index being green. What inspired that? Is it a nod to global warming that people seem to be ignoring, or not paying attention to enough? Even though I remember reading about global warming when I was in elementary school, and I'm a grandmother now. So, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, that poem, I think is actually one of the latest poems that I had written that's included in the book. And I believe it was the summer of 2020. It must have been the summer of 2021, maybe 2022. But I had there's a particular summer where there were wildfires in Canada that were just so extreme that the smoke had, the way that the wind currents would just sort of blow the smoke, across the entire like country and then like down into Nebraska, where I'm currently based. But I just remember noticing that every day for a few, like, or like for a week or so, or several weeks probably, like the time kind of runs together. Like, like my memories of this are a little bit hazy. But I remember like there were just several days in the summer where whenever the sun would set, it would just be completely like a perfect circle in the sky as as it's setting, instead of just being the sort of normal, like, I guess, like more hazy sunset, the way that I'm used to seeing it. And so just noticing, and then also looking at the air quality index on my iPhone, like the weather app, um, noticing every single day for a while, it said like, AQI, unhealthy for sensitive groups, or AQI, like, don't, like, it's worse than it was yesterday, or like AQI was just so like, like the sort of warnings that my weather app would give me about going outside and breathing the air. And so sort of noticing that and then thinking about wanting to include that in a poem, because like there was a specific day where it was a green day. It was a clear day. Technically, it was air quality index was better than it was this time yesterday. But then I just felt really sad. Like it was a clear, like, blue skies. Everything like smelled great. It was the summer, and like I went around and walked outside. It wasn't too hot, it wasn't extremely humid. But then I just remember feeling like I feel like crap right now personally. But then like all of these things are sort of showing me a more joyous world than I am feeling right now. And so trying to sort of put those two feelings together of like, I've been waiting for a clear day to, because like I'm a little bit of a sensitive group, or like I notice that if I do walk around outside during one of those, AQI high index days, then like I feel just like noticeably worse the day after if I'm walking around outside. So I was waiting for a day to go outside this entire week. But then when I did finally get a chance to go outside, it was just like, I feel like crap. Like I'm in the sunlight right now and I feel like crap. And so just thinking about that feeling and thinking about how to put that sort of incongruous feeling together into words. And so that's where that sort of inspiration came from, I guess.
So, I want to know, a lot of aspiring writers watch, and I'm wondering if you have any advice as a published author. What advice do you have to aspiring writers? And I noticed that you said one of your practices that you had a reading practice. Reading seems to have fallen by the wayside. So, talk about what your best advice would be to aspiring writers who may be watching tonight.
I can offer a couple of pieces of advice. One is I always say, only half jokingly, go to medical school, in the sense that if you have something else that you do that you're both passionate about and can keep a roof over your head, when you do have time to write, you can really focus on your writing and you don't have to worry about other things. And I do hear amazing stories every day that are inspiring. And the other thing I always tell people is when you submit your work to the world, be relentless. Don't be discouraged. I don't know what the record is for rejection letters, but I have over 21,000 now. I actually keep a very long list of them. So someday, posthumously, if any of my writing ever becomes well known, I will know somebody will have a record of all my failures. But you only see, when you look at people who are very successful, their successes. You don't see their failures. But people who are successful have usually failed a lot along the way.
That is super
What
impressive.
what amazing
Yeah, sorry.
advice. That is so true. No, no, go ahead, Carolina.
Yeah, and I just want to say, first of all, like I aspire to have that same record and that same kind of like, I guess like knowledge of just like, yeah, there are going to be so many yeah, failures along the way. Like I think one of the things that I used to do when I was first starting to submit my work out into like literary journals, things like that, I used to keep a record of all the like I called it a resume of failures, like to almost like pretend like okay, all of the things that I applied for or tried to submit for, but then didn't actually get, I did try to keep a record of just like I want to increase this resume as much as possible. But then eventually it became too much to actually keep up, and so I don't actually keep that anymore. But then I do still like more rejections come in than acceptances, and yeah, that relentless I guess like almost endurance in a way, or sort of keeping in mind that like your writing is out there sort of fighting for you, and so it's like trusting that you're putting your best work out there, and trusting that it is going to catch attention as long as you sort of stay true to whatever you feel is the thing that you want to say most to readers. I think that in a way, like I mentioned the reading practice that I did this time last year during the summer, and part of that was just because like my degree sort of requires me to keep a reading list or create a reading list and then read all these texts that I technically have chosen. But then sometimes like if I start reading a book and I'm like I'm not actually jiving with the style of this, or like I'm not actually enjoying what I'm reading right now, then sometimes like knowing when to say like okay, this is not actually my taste, but then I'm still learning from it somehow. So what am I learning? And I think also having that I guess like a learning growth mindset, I guess is the sort of the term that I've heard in various like teaching circles, but like having a growth mindset of knowing that there's so much to learn about writing, and instead of feeling like oh I'm never going to learn all of that about writing, feeling like no, I am going to learn, I am going to grow, I am going to get better, as long as I sort of keep going for this. And so yeah, that's like I guess yeah, like staying true to whatever it is you feel like is the thing that you want to say most to readers. I think that might also be another thing that I might suggest and encourage writers, aspiring writers, to sort of keep in mind.
Sage advice from both of you. I love the whole idea of a resume of failures, and I think every writer has a book of rejections. And I think what aspiring writers need to know is that every rejection is a step toward an acceptance, and that sometimes a journal may not like your piece, but that doesn't mean it's a bad piece. It might be that they've published something similar, or the style doesn't work, or whatever. So I think that about wraps things up. I just want to alert everyone to that our next reading will be on. It's on July 10th at 8:30 Eastern Time and 5:30 Pacific Time. Both Jacob's and Carolina's books are available on Unsolicited Press's webpage. Just go to books and find their books, and happy reading. So thank you everyone for viewing, and we are very happy that you joined us this evening. I forgot to tell everyone, but it's now too late at the end of the show, that if you had wanted to make a comment, we would have been able to see it or ask a question. So I apologize for that. But we will see you on the 10th of July, and ciao. Good night, everyone. Thank you.